Here we are again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now I'm going to introduce Family 35. I can well imagine that many people are hearing about Family 35 for the first time. It refers to a line of transmission within the broad Byzantine river of manuscripts, and I gave it that name. So far as I know, the academic world is severely ignoring my work, as they must, to be sure, since I expose the falsehoods they have been purveying for generations. I will begin with a bit of recent history. When Thomas Nelson Incorporated published my first book in 1977, The Identity of the New Testament Text, the best printed Greek New Testament that was readily available was the Textus Receptus, or the received text. It was the Greek text of the Protestant Reformation. John William Burgon, Dean of Chester, called it the traditional text. Although Zane C. Hodges and Arthur L. Farstad had started working on a majority text based on the work of Herman von Soden, it was not published until 1982. In 1977, I demonstrated that the Westcott-Hort critical theory was false at every point, and that demonstration has never been refuted since, that I know of. But when it came to offering an alternative, I was limited to generalities and Burgon's 7 notes of truth. Those notes are: 1. Antiquity or primitiveness; 2. Consent of witnesses or number; 3. Variety of evidence or Catholicity; 4. Respectability of witnesses or weight; 5. Continuity or unbroken tradition; 6. Evidence of the entire passage or context; 7. Internal considerations or reasonableness. Thomas Nelson put my book through at least 3 further printings, including some revision, the last one appearing in 1990. Even then, I had nothing better to offer. However, in 1988, I helped to start the Majority Text Society along with Zane Hodges, Art Farstad, and Frank Carmichael, and I was its first president. At that time, I began to seriously work on majority text theory, and during the next decade, I developed what I was pleased to call original text theory. I used it as a stepping stone to my present approach to New Testament textual criticism, that we may call Family 35 priority theory. Here is my description of original text theory. First, OTT is concerned to identify the precise original wording of the New Testament writings. Here I reject the allegation that the original wording is lost and gone. 2. Second, the criteria must be biblical, objective, and reasonable. Here I reject the dependence on subjective criteria and a purely rationalistic approach. Third, a 90% attestation will be considered unassailable, and 80% virtually so. My comment now is this is now superseded by advances in point 5 below, although a 90% attestation remains difficult to assail. Fourth, Burgon's notes of truth will come into play still, especially where the attestation falls below 80%. This point is now totally superseded by advances in point 5, although his notes remain valid in general. Fifth, where collations exist, making possible an empirical grouping of the manuscripts on the basis of shared mosaics of readings, this must be done. Such groups must be evaluated on the basis of their performance and be assigned a credibility quotient. A putative history of the transmission of the text needs to be developed on the basis of the interrelationships of such groups. Demonstrated groupings and relationships supersede the counting of manuscripts. That last sentence has always been in bold type. Now I have a comment on that. Please note that I'm not referring to any attempt at reconstructing a genealogy of manuscripts. I agree with those scholars who have declared such an enterprise to be virtually impossible. There are altogether too many missing links. I am indeed referring to the reconstruction of a genealogy of readings, and thus of the history of the transmission of the text. That last sentence that above has always been emphasized. Once all manuscripts have been collated and empirically grouped, we can dispense with counting them. But that hasn't happened yet, unfortunately. 6. It presupposes that the Creator exists and that He has spoken to our race. It accepts the implied divine purpose to preserve His revelation for the use of subsequent generations, including ours. It understands that both God and Satan have an ongoing active interest in the fate of the New Testament text. To approach New Testament textual criticism without taking due account of that interest is to act irresponsibly. My further comment on that: those who exclude the supernatural from their model are condemning themselves to never arrive at the truth. God and Satan exist, and both have been involved in the transmission of the New Testament text. 7th, and this is the last point in my theory, it insists that presuppositions and motives must always be addressed and evaluated. My further comment: in any scientific inquiry, a rigorous distinction must be made between evidence, presupposition, and interpretation. Since one's presuppositions heavily influence, even control, his interpretation of the evidence, that should be the same for everyone, any honest scholar needs to state his presuppositions openly. It is doubtless too much to expect sinners to expose their motives to the light of day. See John chapter 3, verse 20. Moving on, I use the term stepping stone because I was still thinking in terms of a large majority, and that was because Family 35 had not yet come to my attention. I was still limited to generalities. However, the 5th point above shows the direction in which I was heading. Note especially the last sentence, which has always been in bold type, and most especially the term demonstrated. For example, my critical apparatus for revelation gives the evidence in terms of Hoskier's 9 groups rather than percentages of manuscripts. Just in passing, I would say that Hort did the discipline a considerable disservice by positing theoretical text types devoid of evidence and then treating them as established fact. To proceed, nevertheless, in 2003, Whiff and Stock Publishers published The Identity of the New Testament Text number 2 as an academic reprint. It contained further revision, but it still used Burgon's Notes of Truth, although I did introduce a Family 18 that I soon changed to Family 35. By 2002, I had become aware of Family 35, but my development of a theory surrounding it was still tentative and incomplete. By the time, excuse me, by the time Whiff and Stock published The Identity of the New Testament Text number 3 in 2012, I had done sufficient work on that theory to replace Burgon's Notes of Truth with it. That is to say, a Family 35 theory. But to go back a little bit, it was the Hodges-Farstad Majority Text presentation of the evidence for the Pericope Adulterae that caught my attention, being based on von Soden's supposed collation of over 900 manuscripts. In passing, we may note that Maurice Robinson's collations show that Soden regularized the data. As stated in their apparatus, that is to say, Hodges and Farstad, there were 3 main streams: M5, M6, and M7. M7 was always in the majority except for one 5-way split where there is no majority, because it was always accompanied by either M5 or M6. That is, M5 and 6 never go against 7. That's important. 5 and 6 never go against 7. This looked to me like 3 independent streams where seldom would more than one go astray at any given point. Being the common denominator, M7 was clearly the best of the 3, and presumably also the oldest. Then I went to Revelation in Hodges-Farstad and noticed 3 main streams again, MAB, MC, and MDE. The picture was analogous to that of the PA. I'm using PA for the pericope. Revelation represents a very much larger corpus than does the PA, but even so, there are only 8 cases where AB and DE join against C, plus 6 others where one of the 4 is split. But that is compared to over 100 cases each for A, B, and C against D and E, and for C and D and E against A and B. More than 100 each. Again, being the common denominator, MC was clearly the best of the 3. For more, you can see the apparatus of my Greek text for the Apocalypse. Now then, it so happens that M7 in the PA and MC in Revelation equals Soden's KR. So I began to smell a rat. Excuse me. Why smell the rat? Because M7 is clearly older than M5 and 6 in the PA, and MC is older than MAB and MDE in Revelation. But von Soden claimed that KR was a revision of KX. How could it be a revision if it was older? Then, the Text und Textwort series proved that KR is independent of KX throughout the New Testament. It follows that KR cannot be a revision of KX. Then there are hundreds of places where KR has overt early attestation against KX, but there is no pattern to that early attestation. If there is no pattern, there is no dependency. Let me repeat that. If there is no pattern, there is no dependency. There being no pattern, then KR must be early, as the picture in the PA and in Revelation has already implied. If KR is early and independent, then it must be rehabilitated in the practice of New Testament textual criticism. If it is the best line of transmission in the Pericope Adulterae and Revelation, it just might be the best elsewhere as well. But there is an ingrained disdain or antipathy toward the symbol KR. So I have proposed a new name for that text type. We should substitute family 35 for KR. It is more objective and will get away from the prejudice that attaches to the latter. Minuscule 35 contains the whole New Testament and reflects KR throughout, and it is the manuscript with the smallest number that meets those qualifications. Minuscule 18 has a smaller number and also contains the whole New Testament, but it defects from the text type in Revelation. Now, for example, cursives 1 and 13 are the smallest number in their families, and like them, 35 is not always the best representative. It is generally excellent, but it is 11th century, and it is a copy of an older exemplar, not a new creation. So, the text type could not have been created in the 12th century. QED. This is an abbreviation for the Latin quod erat demonstrantum. The point to be proved has been proved. If you didn't get that, manuscript 35 is 11th century, so it could not, the family could not have been produced a century later. Okay, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Family 35 represents about 16% of the total of extant, that is known, Greek manuscripts. But it is almost never entirely alone. However, the roster of other manuscripts is almost never the same, and this throughout the New Testament. Does not this indicate that family 35 is the common denominator? Because the roster of other manuscripts is almost never the same, it is possible to factor out the manuscripts that represent family 35. As I stated at the beginning of part 1, or the 11th video if you've been following this, the original text is the ultimate archetype, so any candidate must also be an archetype. A real, honest-to-goodness, objectively verifiable archetype. There is only one that has been identified so far, family 35. Most of the words in the New Testament have virtually 100% attestation from the excellent Greek manuscripts, but where there is disagreement, it is the mosaic or profile of shared readings that define a family or line of transmission. I have published the profile that defines family 35 throughout the New Testament. It is included in 2 of my books, The Identity of the New Testament Text, number 4, and God Has Preserved His Text, both editions of that. Those books may be purchased from Amazon.com or downloaded from my site, www.prunch.org. So now,